We'll be starting in 2 minutes. Cora, just to check to see if the people who are joining us via the Teams meeting can hear us. Can you indicate if you can hear?
I can hear you.
That's great, and we can hear you. Thank you. Okay. Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Welcome to the Community Development Committee Extraordinary Meeting for the hearing of submissions on the draft alcohol policy. The meeting is being recorded and live streamed to the Council's YouTube channel, and it will be available after the meeting on the Council's website. Some submitters are attending the meeting via Teams, and they can be seen on the screen. Health and safety for the Council Chamber. This is a non-smoking venue. In the event of an emergency, we'll follow the committee administrators through the marked exits, which are marked with a little green running man, and the assembly point is the clock tower in the square. There's a defibrillator available on the ground floor near customer services. So I will start with apologies. Apologies from the Mayor on Council business. Apologies from Councillor Harpeter, and apologies from Ms Danielle Harris. Are there any other apologies?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think it's unlikely, but if we're still going at 11, I'll be apologies for early departure on Council business.
Thank you. Okay, I'm happy to move that the apologies be accepted. Do we have a seconder? Councillor Beattie. I'll invite you to vote. Thank you. That has carried, 13 votes for and none against. Item 2 is additional items. Are there any additional items? Okay. Item 3 is declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest? Councillor Hancock.
Madam Chair, I declare an interest in item 5. I've previously made submissions on the LAP, and so I will withdraw and not take part in that item.
Thank you. Item 4 is public comment. Apart from the submitters, is there anyone here to make public comment? No. Okay, so we'll move to item 5 then, which is the hearing of submissions. Just let me check one procedural thing. Do we need to move these first? Yes, please. So in order to hear the submitters, I will move the recommendations that we hear the submissions from presenters who indicated they wish to be heard, and that the committee note the procedure for hearing of submissions as described in the procedure sheet. So I'll move that. The Deputy Mayor will second, and we will vote on that. That's carried, 12 votes for and none against. Thank you. So we'll now move into hearing the submitters, and thank you for bearing with us while we go through our little bit of procedure. The submitters will each have 10 minutes to speak, and we'll be using the traffic light system. So it'll be 7 minutes on green, 2 minutes on orange, and 1 on red, and then the buzzer will go. And if you wish to allow time for questions, then don't speak for the whole of the 10 minutes, and that will give the opportunity for elected members to ask questions. So the first submission is from New Zealand Police Manawatu, and I'd like to invite Inspector Ross Grantham to speak. Kia ora, Ross. Just turn your microphone on there with the press button. Yep, thank you.
Kia ora. Ina mana ina reo ina rao rangatirama. Nā mihi kia katoa katoa. E te mana whenua I te rohi nei. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Ross Grantham tōku anō. I am the Prevention Manager for Manawatu and make submissions on behalf of Palmerston Police. A reduction in trading hours for licensed and off-licensed premises will have an impact on minimising harm within our community. Establishing consistent trading hours across all licenses provides equity to all businesses and transparency in decision making. The police in their submission seek the council to reconsider the current LAP version 3 and return to the original draft LAP version 2 for on-licensed premises, restricting sales from 8 a.m. to 2 a.m. The restriction in trading hours will have a positive reduction in violent crime, disorder and injuries from the consumption of alcohol. The proposal for reduction in trading hours for off-licensed premises in the version, LAP version 3 is supported by police as sales have a direct link to preloading and family harm. As a member of the Safety Advisory Board, I can advise that the board supports the submissions made by police. Please submit that there is a direct link between sale of alcohol on licensed premises and alcohol-related harm, contrary to the Council's research report. Much is made of preloading by submitters, and this problem behaviour is exacerbated by licensed alcohol sales as the preloaders are topped up. An additional hour of alcohol sales has an effect on these patrons. Please note the finger-pointing between supermarket and bottle store conglomerates, advising the assertion that preloaders buy their alcohol from bottle stores rather than supermarkets is disingenuous. I have many experiences of dealing with preloaders and can say that their alcohol supplies are purchased from supermarkets as much as bottle stores. Empirical evidence for this reduction in trading hours is based on the research of Professor Connor of Otago University. It's New Zealand-based research, and it indicates an hour's reduction in alcohol sales can reduce violent crime by 11%. Her research was published on the 22nd of July this year, which is quite fortunate. Professor Connor and her researchers found that incidents of hospitalised weekend assaults to be much higher in 15 to 29-year-olds than in any other age group, the same cohort where the prevalence of hazardous drinking is highest. Comparisons of data when an hour earlier closing time restrictions were implemented was interrogated, enabling Professor Connor to estimate an 11% reduction in weekend assault hospitalisations, with a maximal reduction of 18% in 15 to 29-year-old cohort. Translating this to the Palmerston North City late-night drinking scene, the 18 to 29-year-olds would be the significant majority of patrons attending our licensed premises. Therefore, changes in the trading hours would have the biggest impact on this cohort, with a corresponding increased reduction in violent crime, either as a victim or an offender. Professor Connor also refers to a 2015 New Zealand research report on alcohol purchasing, which identifies 77% of drinkers purchasing from on-licensed premises between midnight and 4 a.m. were 18 to 24-year-olds, and 66% of them being at-risk drinkers. Purchases from off-licensed premises from 8 a.m. to 11 p.m. From 8 p.m. to 11 p.m. were also predominantly from this age group. 67% and 61% were at-risk drinkers. Please submit that this New Zealand-based research provides a tangible direction supporting council in their role of minimising the harm caused by excessive or inappropriate consumption of alcohol. Professor Connor provides a more compelling direction to reduce the trading hours of off-licences on licensed premises, in that her research also discovered fewer assault hospitalisations involving children could be plausibly related to reducing drinking in the 15 to 29-year-olds. This was particularly so for infants. In my discussions with Professor Connor, she did advise caution with this discovery, as it was a byproduct of their research and it needs further investigation. Please submit that a reduction in the trading hours of off-licensed and on-licensed premises will have a positive impact on minimising the harm caused by excessive or inappropriate consumption of alcohol, including the health and well-being of the most vulnerable, our children. Police, in response to the submissions, police say that yes, we did run a voluntary 2 a.m. trial, as highlighted by some submitters, but we say that it cannot be relied upon as a positive support either way, as unfortunately there was no trial evaluation in place. Information from the police intelligence team, in fact, indicates that there was a slight reduction of violence during that voluntary trial. Submitted stated anecdotal evidence showed that violence increased, and this was attributed to people preloading before coming into town and on licensed premises. The data shows there was an increase of only 7 offences over the whole year, May 17 to April 18. Police again submit that preloading is only part of the issue because the violence, disorder and drunkenness predominantly still occurs at closing time or after, not when the patrons first come to town or on licensed premises. The second part of the issue is that on licensed premises top up the preloaders, which adds to the behaviour of the patrons and can be cause of violence, disorder and drunkenness. Some submitted stated they saw a drop in patronage and revenue due to the on-licensed premises not participating in the trial, drawing their customers away. Should a 2 a.m. closing time be introduced, then all licensed premises would be subject to the same time, and it would be fair. The argument raised regarding financial loss needs to be balanced with the operating costs. Anecdotally, police are informed by employees of on-licensed premises that the last hour of trading doesn't cover cost. The submission from police that trading hours be reduced to 2 a.m. closing time would not affect the patrons' time to share the nightlife activity. It would simply mean a behavioural change. Our city is not a destination that attracts the party scene public, nor does our commerce rely upon it. And if the council is to consider this argument, then police would ask them to look at other international cities that do rely upon this commerce and note that their liquor licensing laws restrict them to a 2 a.m. closing time. Reduction of alcohol related harm should not only be focused on members of our community. Please submit that the council should also consider our emergency services and hospital who have to deal with the intoxicated and disorderly patrons attending alcohol-fueled disorder, violence and the like. To meet this demand, Palmerston North Police have modified their roster, providing 2 public safety teams to be working. We submit that reducing the trading hours for on-licensed premises will have a positive effect on the health and well-being of police officers. Police support the proposal to address preloading by reducing trading hours proportionally across all licensed premises. Regarding the one-way door policy, police support the one-way door policy. The Whangarei evaluation showed it made people feel safer, although there was no proof that it made them safer. In the discretionary conditions, police have no submissions. Trading hours for off-licences, police believe a consistent approach to all off-licence premises is wise. Different closing times for various off-licence premises is commercially unfair and difficult to manage. Issuing of further off-licences, all licensed premises, either on or off-licensed premises, have to accept that they contribute in some way to alcohol-related harm. Therefore, there is an intricately fine line between availability and restrictions to keep our people safe. Reported family harm is on the increase, and police can say that alcohol is a symptom in a high proportion of these episodes. Police submit, while accepting the above statements, they are not seeking restrictions on number of off-licences. They would seek from council a confirmation that careful consideration will be applied to each new licence. In conclusion, Palmerston North City Council's goal, which is supported by police, is to have a safe community which is an attractive place to live, work and visit. The police experience of family harm episodes, or at 3 a.m. on a Saturday and Sunday morning, as detailed, does not support that. Please submit that a reduction in trading hours for on-licensed and off-licensed premises will have an impact on minimising harm within our community. Establishing consistent trading hours across all licences provides equity to all businesses and transparency for decision making. When considering the LAP, the Council should not focus only on the submissions made, but on the silent majority of our community who trust the Council to make sound decisions on their safety within the community. It is only 60 minutes. 60 minutes that could save people in our community from being a victim of alcohol abuse. Some we see as in emergency services, and some in our homes we never see. Actions need to be taken to reduce alcohol-related harm, and restrictions on trading hours is one strategy that research informs us will have a positive outcome. Thank you.
Thank you. We do have one question. Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just had a couple of questions. First, on the Professor Connor research that you referenced in your submission, that covers age 15 to 29-year-olds, but then you extrapolate that into saying, well, this is 18 plus. Was there any data in that research which drew out the 15 to 18 element rather than...
So Professor Connor's research identified the 15 to 29-year-olds as the most at-risk cohort. I have just then shaped it down to 18 to 29 because that's the age we should be going into our hotels. It could actually be the 15-year-olds. So
we don't know what that percentage is in the 15 to 18 rather than the 18 to 29?
sorry.
Okay, thank you. And my other question was really about, you referenced anecdotal evidence from employees of businesses that the last hour doesn't meet trading costs.
Yes.
Oh, that's not something we've heard from the business owners, so we'll get an opportunity to ask them later today. I just wondered if it makes sense to you that the business owners would be not in favour of that if they were losing money in that last hour?
That's a question you'd have to ask them. Certainly if it was my business, I wouldn't be putting my people out there to trade if I wasn't making money.
Exactly. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Inspector Grantham. Our time is up now, so thank you for your submission. So the next submitter is Mid-Central District Health Board's Public Health Service, and Dr. Rob Weir is presenting the submission. It's page 98. Kura, Dr. Weir, you know the score, so you can start when you're ready.
Thank you. Good morning, kia ora, everybody. So thank you for the opportunity to speak to the Community Development Committee extraordinary meeting today. As you'll be aware, this is the third time I've been presenting to versions of this committee, so you're probably used to what I'm going to say by now, but we'll go through it again anyway. So, just for clarity, I'm speaking on behalf of the Mid-Central DHB, and in particular on behalf of the Mid-Central Public Health Unit that sits within the DHB. I'm also presenting as a Medical Officer of Health today. Members of the committee will be aware that both the police and medical officers of health have a special position within the Sale and Supply of Alcohol Act legislation. And in particular, there's also mention of both of our roles in the local alcohol policy areas of the legislation. Clearly, there are some key decisions that this committee needs to make today in relation to PNCC's local alcohol policy. And I've covered our position in our submission dated 9th of October, which I will take as read. I do wish to emphasise a few points, however. And my main emphasis is going to be on the on-licence closing time. I just want to start by reminding members of the object of the Sale and Supply of Alcohol Act. So the object of the Act states, the sale, supply and consumption of alcohol should be undertaken safely and responsibly. And B, the harm caused by the excessive or inappropriate consumption of alcohol should not be minimised. There's no mention of commercial interests in the object of the Act. The first two times I was presenting to the committee on this subject, the proposed latest closing hour for on-licences was 2 a.m. And the current proposed LAP, it is 3 a.m. I'm opposed to the 3 a.m. latest closing hour, but would support the previously proposed 2 a.m. latest closing hour. My position is on the basis that the later on-licensed premises trade into the night, the higher levels of alcohol harm are felt. It gets worse after midnight, and each additional hour of trading tends to see more alcohol-related harm. Like the police, I've also had a look at Professor Connor's recent research publication from July of this year. I might add that this research publication is in an internationally recognised journal. It's peer-reviewed and is therefore, from my view, robust evidence. We've heard about the 2 a.m. trial. I'm not aware that that has been published in a peer-reviewed journal, and so therefore I put much more credence in Professor Connor's research than other research that has not been accorded that same scrutiny. I'd just like to read out to you the overall conclusion from Jeannie Connor's research. The final conclusion, which I think summarises it overall, stated, beneficial effects of modest nationwide restrictions on the late-night availability of alcohol. So just to be clear, Professor Connor was saying that with modest changes in closing hours, there were clear beneficial effects from that reduction in opening hours. And again, just to be clear, the two key endpoints in that study were hospital admissions for assault and police documented assaults between 9 p.m. and 5:59 a.m. Speaking on behalf of my emergency department colleagues, you'll be aware of the implications that closing hours can have on ED attendances, for example. I'm also aware that the committee does have to strike a balance between commercial interests and health concerns. However, I do go back to the purpose of the Act, which is related to alcohol-related harms. And it is on that basis that I do commend the committee to recommend 2 a.m. as the latest closing hour for on-licences. I remain supportive of the proposed 9 p.m. latest closing hour for off-licences. So thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you. I've got no one in the queue at the moment. Is there anyone wishing to ask a question? Councillor Naylor.
Thank you, and thank you for coming to here this morning. Just one of your final comments, you talked about the impact of closing hours on ED attendance, and I'm just wondering if you would be happy to clarify if there is some direct evidence of alcohol-related harm that does, impact on the level of ED attendance at that time of the morning or night.
Early hours of the morning, yes. Really, I just go back to Professor Connor's research, again, with the, one of the two key endpoints being hospital admissions related to assaults. So I'm not sure if you're looking for more local evidence in that, but that is New Zealand-based research that had that finding.
Okay. Thank you. That's helpful.
Thank you. There are no further questions, so thank you for your submission.
Thank you.
The next submitter is submitting via Teams, and it's Te Herenga Hora Health Promotion Agency, and Kathy Bruce, Principal Advisor Local Government, will be speaking. Kathy, are you hearing us loud and clear?
Yes, can you hear me?
Pardon?
Can you hear me?
I can. Councillors, can you hear Kathy okay? Yeah. Okay, Kathy, I don't know if you can see the traffic lights, which are just to the right of me, but in any case, you've got a maximum of 10 minutes to speak, including questions.
No, I can't see them, but that's all right. I should be relatively quick. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Kathy Bruce tōku ingoa, no hakateri aho, kei ototahi tōku kaina inaianei, kanui te mihi kia koutou, nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. I'm the Principal Advisor Local Government at Te Herenga Hora, which is the Health Promotion Agency, and I'm based in Christchurch. My role is to support local government to reduce alcohol-related harm, including providing support around the Sale and Supply of Alcohol Act, and in particular the development of strategies and plans to reduce alcohol-related harm. Many of you will have met our Central Region Manager, Giselle, in the past. She's currently on secondment to ACC, so I want to take the opportunity. Online we have Jessica Jones, who's newly into this role and is sitting in as she hasn't done a submission to a council like this before. So thank you for providing us with the opportunity to speak to you about your local alcohol policy. We're a Crown entity and we were formed on the 1st of July 2012 through the merger of the Alcohol Advisory Council and the Health Sponsorship Council. And we also have some health promotion functions previously delivered by the Ministry of Health. Te Herenga Hauora gives advice to government and other stakeholders and makes recommendations on the sale, supply, consumption caused by alcohol. The work that Te Herenga Hauora undertakes aims to prevent and reduce this harm and inspire New Zealanders to make better decisions about alcohol and their health and well-being. The work we undertake around alcohol was funded through a levy on alcohol at the point of production and at the time of input for the sale into New Zealand. We're also one of the few health agencies that has provided feedback on all alcohol policies across the country. You've already seen the content of our written submission, so today we would like to highlight a few of the main points. This will focus on showing our support for the work that Palmerston North has undertaken, as well as suggesting some changes that we think would result in a stronger local alcohol policy that better meets the objectives of the Act. Firstly, Te Herenga Hauora would like to congratulate Palmerston North on developing a LAP as provided for in the Sale and Supply of Alcohol Act. We believe that a LAP is an important mechanism to improve public input into how alcohol is sold in your region. Improving public input is important as we know that alcohol-related harm is an issue that affects the well-being of many communities. However, some communities in particular carry a much greater burden of harm. The Council has a role to play to address these burdens by taking the opportunity to putting in place evidence-based measures to minimise that harm and to prevent further harm from occurring in areas that experience disproportionate harm. Research shows that people's drinking behaviour is influenced by their local environment, and we know that communities can do a great deal to reduce local alcohol-related harm. We also know that local communities have an interest in alcohol policy, and this is evident in the range of issues raised in alcohol-related submissions and the number of communities becoming active in alcohol licensing applications across the country. Councils play a crucial role in encouraging this change of drinking behaviour in their communities. To assist you, we have an Act with very clear objectives. They are that the sale, supply and consumption of alcohol should be undertaken safely and responsibly, and that the harm caused by excessive or inappropriate consumption of alcohol should be minimised. We encourage you to keep these objectives in mind as you make your decisions. Palmerston North has an opportunity to make a real difference to the harm caused by alcohol in your community. Overall, we found the draft policy was easy to read and the content easy to understand, and this is important for it to be accessible to licensees, the community and the District Licensing Committee. We also want to compliment Palmerston North on their background report, especially given the constraints around sourcing good local data. We do want to focus on the trading hours, as the current submitters have. Limiting trading hours for the sale of alcohol is a key policy lever for reducing alcohol-related harm. Research shows both an increase in the harm when trading hours are increased and a decrease in harm when trading hours are reduced. Evidence around the impact of making changes to on-licensed trading hours is consistent and shows reductions in both consumption and alcohol-related harm. We are disappointed that the revised policy has extended the trading hours for hotels and taverns to 3 a.m. with a one-way door policy instead of keeping it at the original 2 a.m. end of trading. Evidence for reducing hours is substantially stronger than it is for a one-way door policy. We don't see how this extension to trading hours and widening it to all hotels and taverns will contribute to minimising the alcohol-related harm in your community. That is the purpose of the Act and a key reason for local alcohol policies to exist within the legislation. And we do want to remind that although it is tricky to balance harm against the economic and especially given COVID, we do want to remind you that ALA has been clear that policy decisions based on economic concerns have no place in a local alcohol policy. We strongly encourage the Council to reconsider this change to on-licence hours, as we are unaware of any benefits to later trading hours that outweigh the harm and costs to your community. However, we are supportive of both the off-licence and club proposed trading hours. We encourage councils to reduce their off-licence hours, as there is emerging evidence that reducing late night hours can reduce rates of violence associated with ambulance call-outs, hospital admissions and general alcohol-related harm. In terms of the number of premises, there is growing body of peer-reviewed evidence, both internationally and from New Zealand, about the impact of density and the number of premises on alcohol-related harm. We have mentioned studies in our written submission which provide evidence to support that decreasing the numbers of alcohol outlets is strong. Te Haringa Holder supports tools that will assist with limiting the number of outlets and is aware that a number of councils around New Zealand have proposed measures within their draft laps, especially in communities where there is already high community stress and evident alcohol-related harm. We encourage the council to include a policy around the number of licensed premises, and we're happy to provide examples from other territorial authorities. In terms of sensitive sites, the Law Commission found that communities feel very strongly about the location of premises near sensitive sites and the number of premises in their area. Given that laps are one of the main mechanisms for communities to have a say about where alcohol is sold, we encourage councils to consider policies in these areas. The purpose of policies around location are to protect the most vulnerable and to limit the growth of premises in areas that have sensitive sites. Your own data around the disproportionately high number of bottle stores located in high deprivation areas raises a further concern that the council should be considering the location of premises as part of your local alcohol policy. Once again, we are happy to provide some examples from other territorial authorities. So in conclusion, we are supportive of Palmerston North developing a draft lap, but we encourage you to be bold and ensure that the policy reflects the views of your community and takes the opportunity to minimise the harm caused by alcohol in your district. Once again, thank you for the opportunity to make this submission.
Thank you, Cathy. We have got elected members wishing to ask questions. We'll start with Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Cathy. Trust you can hear me clearly from Christchurch. You mentioned that there was evidence that earlier closing was stronger or had greater efficacy than a one-way door policy. And I just wanted to drill into that a little bit and understand from your comment, was that because we have a lack of evidence around the impacts of one-way doors, or is it because we have very clear evidence about both closing time and one-way doors and we know that there's a winner there?
There's a bit of both. One-way doors are notoriously hard to evaluate. They often have other things going on, and the police referred to the whangarei evaluation, which was actually done by our organisation, and they are really tricky to evaluate because just something little like more police being on the streets can impact the outcomes of that. However, evidence around on-licence hours and reducing hours is really, really clear. There's been a meta-analysis done of 21 studies, of which 7 were in Australia. Very clear evidence that the reduction of hours, even by an hour, makes a big difference. Some of the Australian studies have shown up to sort of 17 to 20-something% in reduction in harm by reducing by an hour. And the other one is the Ministry of Justice's own research that they did in the lead up to this act showed that the expected rate of offences associated with licensed premises closing at 2:01 instead of 3 a.m. is 4.2 times the expected rate of offences associated with licensed premises closing at 12 o'clock or earlier. So every hour you're open later, the evidence is quite clear that you will see an increase in harm, whether that be police call-out, ambulance call-out, ED presentations.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cathy. Time has run out, but thank you for your submission. And you're welcome to stay online if you want to hear the rest of the submissions.
Thank you.
So now we have submission from the Fish Bar Limited, submitted by Gary Wright and Chris Hinch. Now, Gentlemen, you have got 3 submissions in a row here. How would you like to handle it? Have you got 3 separate submissions to do, or do you want to roll them into one?
No, we plan to just make a single submission and then... So plan to make a single submission and then allow the council to ask questions of effectively the only licensee that is here today, and so actually get some information from on the ground.
Okay, so we'll give you your allotted time as long as the questions last. But in terms of speaking, you're free to speak for as much of that time or as little as you wish.
Yeah.
Okay, so when you're ready, thank you.
Right. Well, thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, councillors, for hearing us today. My name is Chris Hintz. I've been asked by Gary Wright, who is the owner of Bubbles, the Fish Bar and the Celtic Bar, to assist him in his submissions today. Now, we do also note that Brewer's Apprentice, the Cobb, the Daily and Trader McKendry's owners, who are Ian McQueen, sorry, I was going to call him Ian McLean, Ian McQueen, known as Bear, and Ricky Quirk, though they haven't submitted, have been talking with Gary and have endorsed basically everything that he wants to say today. Now, first point we want to make is that no professional bar or club owner or employee is the least bit interested in having bad behaviour and having intoxication and having violence occur within their establishment. It sort of feels like in some ways that the problems of society sometimes get lumped onto this industry, into the hospitality industry. There is, I would suggest, a want, especially among people between, we'll say, 15 to 29 for the sake of the study, to actually enjoy themselves, to socialise, to party, and to sometimes involve alcohol. Now, that is probably best done within a supervised environment where there are professional staff, where there are people there who are literally paid to be sober, to be trained, to be in charge of the situation, to reduce the amount of potential harm that happens. If people aren't given that opportunity, then do we just push those harms out into society? Do we push those harms out into the suburbs? People saying, well, that's no fun in town, so we'll just have a party at home, and that makes it harder recourse to police. One-way door policies appear to us as almost a feel-good item. There doesn't appear to be any substantial research or information about the effectiveness of one-way door policies, especially if they're treated as a sort of a blunt instrument. And I think that's probably the position we'd like to take on this, is the one-way door policy, and specifically is what we're looking at. Following are some actual examples of issues where people have been excluded from establishments, where they've been separated from friends, and harm has resulted. Staff of hospitality who finish before closing time, who are obviously probably the most sober people in town, aren't able to go out and socialise. So they're denied that opportunity to finish work and then go out and have a beer with their colleagues and their friends. It's a fairly minor harm, I admit. There was a case where there was a Tinder hookup in town. This person was excluded from entering the establishment, was unable to make their Tinder hookup, attempted to break into the establishment, fell from a structure and was severely injured. There was a further case a few years ago of a member of our armed forces who was separated from his friends and undertook a similar action, and that unfortunately resulted in his death. Police have admitted anecdotally to hospitality owners that the trial one-way door process that we had in Palmerston North a few years ago did result in more anger and angst on the road outside of establishments and caused them issues out front of the establishments. Some issues that we would like to highlight to the Council in relation to one-way doors are the potential for one member of a couple, for example, that have gone out to enjoy themselves. One member of that couple steps outside to talk with some friends or some colleagues, steps beyond that one-way door period, and then suddenly that couple has been separated. Probably more seriously, a young person, possibly a female, is separated from their group of friends because they step outside to smoke or vape or catch a breath of fresh air. They go over that period of that one-way door policy, and suddenly they're there on their own in town. A group of friends walking around town, going from one establishment to another, part of the group dawdles or stops to talk. The first group arrives at the establishment and is allowed in at, say, 5 minutes to 2. The second part of the group arrives at 5 minutes past 2 and are not allowed in. So we're separating and breaking people up arbitrarily. That leaves then these people outside that are potentially, one, vulnerable, people that have been cut adrift from their groups, people that have been separated from their friends. What results from that could be anger, could be violence, could be vandalism, could be someone being put at risk by taking risky actions. They're the issues that we'd like to consider around the one-way door. In summary, a one-way door is a blunt instrument that takes away the nuance, the decision-making of professionally trained, professional hospitality staff. If there is a one-way door that's to be created, then there needs to be some mechanism in there to deal with the issues. Moreover, how is a one-way door policed? So if there's a one-way door policy in place and there's a vulnerable person that is allowed to enter into an establishment, to join with friends, to make a phone call, to get away from some trouble, is that then policed by the police? Is it policed by other members of public? What actually happens? How do we police this? What is the outcome? How do we ensure that door staff or professionally trained bar staff aren't held accountable for what was effectively the safest action they could take? The hospitality industry is stretched. Yes, there are some issues, I suppose. Many of those relate to people not wanting to come out and socialise. These issues have been exacerbated through the COVID period. In fact, we have seen now, I won't say post-COVID, but in this lull that we have, people have started coming out later. So where the nightlife started in Palmerston North at about 10:30 last year, this year it's starting later. So it's moving till 11 or even later when people are actually coming out. I think that Councillor Bowen did strike the nail on the head with one issue there. It is unrealistic to suggest that bars are operating at a loss for that last hour. Yes, it is a harder period of time. It's a time where they do have to have more resource in place. It's a time where they have to have their trained and qualified staff in place. But it's not a time when they're losing money. And I think, Gary, you can probably talk to that a little bit more. Ultimately, what we want to do is oppose the one-way door. If there is a one-way door that is to be put in place, we want to have some scope to deal with that in a professional way. A lot of the submissions this morning have been in relation to reducing trading hours. We're not taking a massive position on that. We certainly wanted to see the longer trading hours to still be allowed. Do question, though, if 1 hour reduces potential harms by that much, then why aren't we looking at 2 or 3 or potentially 4 hours reduction in trading? I am old enough to remember midnight closing and 10 o'clock closing, and my memory may be hazy, but I can certainly remember there were alcohol-related harms that happened during those times. I think it is, New Zealand, in fact, experimented with 6 o'clock closing. And that was a decades-long experiment that showed there were alcohol-related harms that happened regardless of how early establishments would close. That's pretty much as we want to say. I'll hand the floor now, if I may, to Gary, if he wants to make any comments, and then if we can pass to the council if they have any questions for either of us.
Thank you.
Chris obviously has basically worked with myself on this, and pretty much what Chris has said is we're not opposed to necessarily a one-way 2 a.m. system, but I think it needs a lot of research, or maybe even we discuss how that can actually how it can minimise the impact with people out on the street if they are just put out on the 2 o'clock. I mean, we're in a unique position where we have 3 bars in a little alleyway. If we have shut one bar early, which we've done prior, and then another one progressively, we're in a zone where people are allowed to, where we have no jurisdiction, where people are allowed to congregate. And if you still have one place open, we're not there to administer or even look after those people because it's outside of our jurisdiction, which is actually taken by our liquor laws. So in our current situation, for example, we may progressively close one bar, then another, and we're managing in that, and that hour gives us the ability to be able to manage it rather than putting people out at the same time. Then we have to ask the question, does our own infrastructure, such as cabs, have the ability to let everybody out at 2 o'clock? Probably not. We have function centres that quite often finish at 1 o'clock, and then they are coming into town, and they may be coming in at different times. You know, again, that's not the patrons' problem, they can't get to time. Our infrastructure, have we had our transport operators to see how this is going to how that's going to impact them and what services they're providing? You know, there is a lot of, I'm open to reducing alcohol harm. I equally believe I'm yet to see a direct correlation or statistics relating to a particular bar necessarily in Palmerston North. When we've trialled the 2 a.m. closing before, we'd asked consistently for 6 months for data. We were denied it. Haven't got it. That was done at our expense. Nobody else's. So I find it somewhat amazing that we can have reports done from other towns, etc. And I'm not saying that they're not validated in any way, shape or form. But why isn't Palmerston doing its own research? Why are we relying on other statistics from other areas when we've got a very good community? I believe what we should be concentrating on, we've got a small element of nightlife, which is predominantly three owners, which pretty much own most of it. Why don't we have more of a concentrated group and try and work together to see if there's a better solution? I'm also a little bit concerned in the demographic where we are in particular, which I'm very proud to what we've accomplished, but the reality is there's a lot of glass windows down either sides of the Regent Arcade, including the Regent Theatre itself. We have more problems over on UCOL, which are not even alcohol harm related. And the amount of break-ins, cars smashed, lack of cameras, you know, same even on Broadway. I think, as Chris has mentioned, we're being pushed. It's almost as if it's not necessarily all the bar owners or the bars trading between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. that is actually responsible here. We're part of an equation or a catalyst at the end that people are looking to point finger at. And if that's the case, then, I mean, if somebody could please show me how many times that we have had an incident over the past 6 years where we have had to go to court for that's directly correlated with how we operate. I'm yet to see that, and it hasn't been that case. So I'm asking if we can look, we have regular council meetings every 3 months, and we seem to be dancing around the same issues. And yet those that are necessarily making the decisions on behalf of the rest of the community, can I invite them to come and see what it is that we actually do between 2 and 3 a.m? Comment made earlier regarding whether or not it's feasible or not to be open between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. Well, I don't think that's anybody else's right to say whether that's profitable or not, and certainly not on employees. Why not come and talk to the business owner? We're the one that have financially employing people, and through a tough time too. I mean, I am proud to say that we haven't had to let anybody go. So if it wasn't feasible, we also use our maturity and experience that if a bar is emptying out, it gives us that scope in that area where we can look closing one down, for example, then the second one progressively, which also gives people time to progress without being forced into a certain time zone and put out on the street at once. So I do invite anybody to come and have a look and see what we do on a regular basis. And then perhaps maybe they would look at it from a different perspective. But as I say, I'm open to assisting and on behalf of colleagues and employers to reducing any alcohol harm. But whether or not this is the right solution. I think a shock approach would also have an impact on people. If we look at the proposal for the 2am closing, if we look at the amount of negative comments, and unfortunately those comments predominantly came from anywhere from 18 to 29-year-olds, if you actually read through the Facebook, they don't really know. Maybe we could enter into an education program where we can set up a Facebook page or something, for example, where we can start educating people on what they can do with alcohol, what the restrictions are coming out, etc. You know, there's so many unexplored options that I believe that we could perhaps have a different approach for.
I think, you know, what Gary's saying there is he's very much a professional operator. I know that Gary has invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in his establishments. I understand that he's now spending, is it $30-something thousand putting cameras in the alleyway outside of his establishments there. He is a professional operator. He's not interested in seeing people harmed or injured or intoxicated if he can be supported to run his business rather than held up as being the cause of the issues, be part of the solution, and would like to work closely with council if possible. I think that's probably as much as we want to say. We'll hand back, if we may, Madam Chair.
Thank you. We have got some questions, so we'll go to Councillor Bowen first.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Chris and Gary, for coming in. Chris, I wanted to pick up on a comment you made about an on-licence being a safer drinking environment than people partying at home. And you talked about trained staff being trained to deal with problem drinking. And then Gary alluded to staff inside venues and outside, your door staff. So I wonder, could you just talk to us about what that training looks like? These are bar staff, surely they're not medical professionals.
I certainly can. Okay, part of my role is I actually do train people in the LCQ, which is the Licence Controllers Qualification course. So the Licence Controllers Qualification course is a course that encompasses 2 unit standards, 4646 and 16705, when you want to look them up. And they're 2 courses, one that look at the structure of the legislation that people have to work within, but then also one that concentrates heavily on how to avoid people getting themselves into trouble, how to avoid intoxication, basically the 7 areas that need to be promoted by bar staff, which are non and low alcoholic drinks, food, responsible promotions, underages, intoxication, transport, how to actually deal with those things on an individual basis. That's a qualification that must be held by each general manager. Now, each general manager can be appointed as a duty manager within a licensed establishment. Every licensed establishment, except for clubs, must have at least one duty manager on site at all times when alcohol is available. So they're probably the most highly qualified person. Amongst the other bar staff, it would be a complete fool that would put anyone into any commercial enterprise without training them. And so we provide training, it's on-the-ground training. It can be quite individualised for individual establishments. That takes into account primarily that harm reduction, that host responsibility training for each of the staff. So they understand when a duty manager tells them they have to do this, they have to provide free water, for example, or promote free water. They understand why, and that comes from the law. Then you have, as you've alluded to, the door staff. Now, it is illegal to put anyone onto a crowd control position unless they have a crowd controller certification. So that's a new law that came into force, I'm going to guess it was about 5-6 years ago, can't even remember. And that was to force the professionalisation of door staff. And we no longer use the term bouncers, for example. Bouncers are people who sort of push people around. Door staff or greeters are people who control the crowd, who filter the crowd, who deal with issues. So they are all professionals. The idea that the late night industry is in any way sort of cowboyish, I think can be dispelled fairly quickly.
Now, Gary mentioned that he was speaking for a number of what I think were the late night operating bars in the city. So there's obviously a relational network there. How does that work with the security staff to manage that potential harm outside venues?
Two main security providers in Palmerston North. One of those is CD Security, the other one is a private group. They communicate quite clearly with each other. They use walkie-talkies to communicate between one bar to the next if there's issues. Obviously, in Gary's situation within the alleyway, he has very direct lines of communication. But if someone was, for example, to leave the Daily who'd been causing particular troubles, that gets communicated directly back. If they're heading over towards the alleyway, that would be communicated back to the door staff over there. So there is strong communication between not just the door staff and the crowd controllers, but there is also strong communication between the owners of each of the establishments, and of course the staff of the establishments socialise together. There's quite a community of hospitality workers.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair.
Councillor, the Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Chris and Gary, for your submission. I've got a couple of questions. There was a comment made around if there was a 2 a.m. closing, would infrastructure allow for that? Are there enough taxis, those sorts of things? So currently we close an hour later at 3 a.m. So what's the difference between infrastructure capacity at 3 a.m. versus infrastructure capacity at 2 a.m.?
I think what you will find, even where we have a progression with the extension of an hour later, if you've put at the moment, for example, everybody out on the street at 2 a.m, right, I think, well, not that I think, it's difficult enough to get a taxi as it is.
At 3 a.m. it's difficult?
Or even sometimes at 2 a.m. You know, so if we've got everybody out in a mass force, I mean, there's numerous taxi companies that have even reduced their staff currently at the moment. You know, I mean, even if we get, I mean, if I can give an example, I took all of our staff out 2 Sundays ago, which took 4 days of organising so we could get the correct amount of taxi numbers because they just don't have them there at certain times and whichever. You know, even on a Friday and Saturday night, they're stretched because COVID's had an impact on them as well. So the reality is if you've got now more parties or things going on at home or different regions, if you have a large function, say, I'm not being detrimental, but say at the racecourse, that finishes at 12:30, 1 o'clock, where you might have 200 or 300 people. How are they getting back into town?
So are you suggesting then that the functions or the people on perhaps the fringe of the CBD would be using the taxis and that's why they wouldn't be available at 2 a.m?
There's that possibility. I mean, I'm not saying people shouldn't be open to whichever time that is allowed, but the reality is already that we don't have an abundance of a public transport system later on at night anyway.
And I think if we take, you know, we've already commented that people are coming out to town later. Okay, so we have this period from about 11:30 when people are arriving. If people then are leaving at some time between 1 and 3, and we're finding that the resources are stretched, then if you push that all back to be 1 and 2, then the resources, of course, are going to be stretched even further. You're reducing that period of time where people could potentially be leaving.
Okay, so work needs to be done around people making plans to get home then?
I think a lot of work needs to be done around educating the public, and certainly those 18 to, I wouldn't even go as high as 29, but 18 to 22-year-olds, possibly a little bit older, a little bit younger. A lot of education would do wonders. Okay.
In regards to the trial that you and a number of others did around closing early at 2 a.m, I think it was a couple of years ago now, wasn't it?
May 2017.
Yeah. And so that was for a 6-month period. Did you, or whether it was you or your collective group, did you engage with a consultant to measure the success of that?
We were approached, and I believe at the time because I think a lot of the consistent problems were focused in a certain area in town. I was approached and basically said, because at that point I'd owned 2 bars and I was asked if I could basically participate. So I said, well, what we'll do is, how about we give it a go? And what we will do is convene each month, etc., to find out how that's progressing, etc., so forth. Now, 6 months down the track, I'd had an estimate we were going to lose X amount of revenue. After 6 months, we were losing 4 times that revenue. Now, the fact of the matter is there was no guarantee or process put in place to say that they wanted to, whilst reducing our voluntary, we gave up, we gave up that right essentially to participate in it. It cost us financially. So then I took it upon myself, and I was the first to say, we will not be in business much longer. So the reality is that I'm implementing our right to be open till 3 a.m. We had also asked for the research, and I remember in one of our regular meetings with the council that we have every 3 months, we'd asked for the Mid-Central Health report on statistics. We weren't allowed it. We'd asked for the police reports on the statistics. We weren't allowed it. So therefore, but we were promised that we were going to be given information to help us decide whether this was a feasible option or it was right.
Sorry.
Sorry,
I-
I'll
if
just
I can
stop
address
you
that.
there for a minute.
Sorry.
Just to let you know, you've got 5 minutes left. There are a number of councillors in the queue. It's your call, but if you make the answers a wee bit shorter, you might get through more questions.
Yeah, sorry, my question was actually around if you had, because I appreciate you said you'd asked for information and that you hadn't given it, but you didn't commission a evaluation or anything like that?
Simple answer is no. It was actually a police initiative, and there were promises that were made that weren't fulfilled, and I won't get into the details of that.
Okay, I'll leave my questions there, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Dennison.
I just come out of the queue, same questions around business performance. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Butt.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, gentlemen, for your submission. Obviously, I'm not an expert on alcohol, but through your experience, do you think that this, whatever harm, alcohol-related harm is related to the excessive drinking?
Yeah, excessive and fast drinking, drinking of, very strong alcohol, you can get sort of RTDs up to 10%, and if you drink those when you're thirsty, then you'll take yourself over.
And I guess from your submission and presentation that you are supporting groups to be allowed to stay together.
Yes.
And I also understand there is no restriction when a group goes in a pub or bar, there's no restriction that everybody who is in the group has to buy their own alcohol on the tab or on the?
Not legally.
No. So is there a mechanism which could check whether somebody from the group is taking most of the alcohol bought by someone else? Is there a mechanism to stop this behavior too?
Yes. Yeah, so absolutely. Bar staff are trained to look out for people that are buying rounds and taking the people that have already been identified as being at danger of becoming intoxicated. That's absolutely part of what we talk about, what we do.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks, Chris and Gary, for coming in. Number of points under discussion, obviously, here, but just wanted to get it clear in my mind what I think I've been hearing through your commentary so far about just two specific options. So if one of those options is 2 a.m. close and the other one is 2 a.m. one-way door with a 3 a.m. close, your preference between those?
Are they the only two options?
I'm not saying they're the only two options, but I'm saying those are two options that are central in our mind, and it would be helpful to know if you have a preference between those two.
Sorry, excuse me. It is a good question. I believe that the preference would be to allow us to continue to do what we're doing, where by having that extended hour, it's giving people a greater period of time to disperse at their own willingness. That way, for example, if you bring it till 2 o'clock and it's bang, done at 2 o'clock. Well, I thought we'd already gone through this in the submissions in February, to be honest, and we were allowed to 3 a.m. and now we were just discussing the potential of a one-way door policy. Yeah. I'm open to a one-way door policy. I just think that we need to sit down and concentrate that's focused on Palmerston with focus based, not just on study from other areas.
If I could comment, perhaps one-way door policy from 2 till 3, but then having some scope, some nuance, some ability within that one-way door policy, rather than just being bang, one-way door. But we say at this point we will change to say we're encouraging people to leave, but we're not going to do that at the detriment of people's behaviour. So we're not going to stop people entering if they're in some sort of danger. We're not going to stop people entering if they are actually stone cold sober. You know, having a bit of subtlety, a bit of professionalism within that rather than being the blunt instrument that it appears to be.
Thanks, that clarifies. Madam Chair.
Thank you. I'll just check how much time we've got left. Okay, we've just got one last question. Councillor Naylor.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks for coming in. Just in relation to the question that the Deputy Mayor asked around the 2 a.m. trial that happened a couple of years ago, you mentioned that the problems were focused on a certain area of town, and I'm just wondering if you could expand on what those problems were.
My understanding, Karen, at the particular time, that I think that Main Street has been a continuous problem for many, many years, irrespective of whether I've been involved in licensed premises or not. And I think my understanding, and having grown up in this town, is that Main Street has always been a very popular area, and with the large congregations there, that's where predominantly, you could say probably 95% of the problems were.
Sorry, my question is what were the problems?
Congregation of people, just mass congregations of people. I think we'll probably find that the police have a very strong presence down Main Street. Perhaps also some of the bars doing very cheap drinks and things like so. And I think it's just been a popular spot that's had 1, 2, 3, 4, almost 5 bars down that area. And just, if you've got, that's where the majority of people go, no matter what time you close, there's going to be problems.
Okay, that's time, I'm afraid, Councillor Naylor. So thank you very much to Gary and Chris. Thank you for your submission and fielding so many questions. So our next submitter is Foodstuffs North Island Limited. Submission is on page 84. And to speak on behalf, we've got Ian Thane, who is joining us through the Teams app. Ian, can you hear me?
I can.
Good, and we can hear you. So you've got 10 minutes to present your submission, and you don't have to speak for the whole 10 minutes if you want to allow some time for questions. We will give you a warning when it's getting close to the end of time.
Thank you. Morena, ko Ian Thane, tēnei kei Konei Aho More Foodstuffs North Island Limited. Thank you for the opportunity to make some brief submissions in support of the written submission that Foodstuffs has already put in. Firstly, Foodstuffs supports the overall scheme of the draft local alcohol policy, and in particular its recognition of the ability for further investment into your district by way of new supermarkets or grocery stores. It recognises that by not putting any specific or express prohibition on new stores or limiting the areas within the district where those new stores could be placed. And by doing that, the policy recognises that in any given case, when any particular licensing application is made, your district licensing committee can, of course, and will, of course, consider the specifics of that application and can make its own decisions around whether or not the application should be granted, and if so, on what terms. And a licensing committee, when doing that, is of course obliged to have regard to the object of the Act, which the other submitters have discussed with you already this morning. That's important because it highlights the distinction between allowing a district licensing committee to make its own decisions around a specific application or a specific applicant, a particular license location, the particular characteristics of the licensee and what the licensee is attempting to do and exactly where that is in the district, on the one hand, versus the proposal in the draft local alcohol policy of maximum trading hours. Those maximum trading hours do not allow a district licensing committee any discretion to grant broader hours for any reason at all. The maximum hours become absolute maxima and therefore do not allow licensing committees to make allowances or make decisions based on any differences between particular licensees. That is at odds with what the courts have said ought to be done. In the Auckland PLAP situation, where Auckland got to the point of a provisional local alcohol policy, there were a number of appeals against that. Those appeals were heard by the authority back in 2015, and the legal stoush over all of that is still going. The matter ultimately went to a judicial review in the High Court, and that didn't end things. We're still off for now an appeal against the outcome of that, which is scheduled for the Court of Appeal at the beginning of next year. Whatever the outcome of that Court of Appeal hearing, there are at least 2 or 3 more steps in that puzzle to go. One of the reasons why Auckland has still not achieved any local alcohol policy at all, according to what the High Court has said, is because Auckland failed to take account of particular local evidence. It failed to take account of the differences between different types of licensee, and in particular different types of off-licensee. Bottle stores on the one hand, supermarkets on the other, grocery stores as a different type of off-licensee, and then there are others as well. Auckland failed to take account of all of those differences by proposing a blanket maximum set of trading hours, and they proposed a 9 p.m. closing time, as you are proposing in your draft LAP, and have been unable to get that past the test in the Act. They failed to recognise the need for flexibility and the need for an evidence-based approach, and in particular, an approach that's based on local evidence. The High Court said that the default trading hours set in the Act, which are 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. for off-licence premises, represented an appropriate balance between people's freedom to purchase and consume alcohol responsibly on the one hand, and the community's right to seek to restrict and limit, or indeed minimise, alcohol-related harm on the other. That national default hours represents an appropriate balance from a national perspective, and the High Court said to differ from that, there ought to be specific local evidence that justifies that change. In Palmerston North, the evidence in your research paper suggests that between 8 p.m. and 10 p.m. at night, the sales of off-licence alcohol are actually lower than the national average. So that piece of local evidence does not support differing from the national default hours in your district. Also, the research report doesn't draw a distinction specifically at the point that the draft LAP proposes, the 9 p.m. On the one hand, it looks at between 8 and 10, and then on the other, it looks at between 10 and 11. So the particular 9 p.m. point that's been chosen for the draft policy isn't even addressed, and that seems a flaw in the decision-making process. Other submitters before me have talked about Professor Connor's research paper, and they've suggested that that shows that there will be a reduction in alcohol-related harm if hours of trade are reduced. But it's important to note that Professor Connor's paper was based around the introduction of the national default hours, which affected both off-licence hours and on-licence hours. By contrast, in New South Wales, there was a natural experiment done where only off-licence hours were reduced in country New South Wales, so everywhere other than downtown Sydney, only off-licence hours were reduced. And the effect of that was actually to adversely affect number of non-domestic assaults. So when maximum trading hours for off-licence premises were reduced, there was an increase in the number of non-domestic assaults occurring. And so New South Wales changed back to an 11 p.m. Maximum trading hour for off-licensed premises. Things were very different in downtown Sydney, where on-licensed trading hours were reduced. That very definitely had a positive effect on reducing alcohol-related harm from excessive and compulsive consumption. Perhaps this reflects the simple point that with off-licensed sales, those customers who aren't going to drink responsibly, those customers who wish to drink to excess or inappropriately, who wish to, for instance, preload, they can simply, of course, shift their time of purchase so that it is before the stores close. The same sort of time shifting is not possible in relation to unlicensed premises. And again, in relation to that, it is important that in your own research, it shows that the majority of purchases for preloading in your district already take place before 9 p.m, and also that the majority of those purchases take place from bottle stores, not from supermarkets. And again, as I said, in the Auckland Provisional Local Alcohol Policy proceedings, the High Court said that Auckland had a flaw in its process because it had failed to consider the difference between supermarkets on the one hand and bottle stores on the other. Supermarkets, of course, are limited to only the sale of beer, wine, and mead. They also are quite distinct because their main business is not the sale of alcohol. Alcohol is part of what they sell as a full service offering, but it is not their core or main business. And also, of course, they are restricted in ways around what they can do with advertising of alcohol, and also the single alcohol area condition that means all their alcohol must be in one part of their store. So for all those reasons, Foodstuffs supports continuing with the default hours for off-licensed sales in your district, which would be a 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. maximum. But in respect of any particular off-licensed premises, District Licensing Committee in your district would, of course, look closely at what were appropriate hours for that particular store, and they could impose more restrictive hours if there was a reasonable basis to do so.
Thank you, Ian. There's no time for questions, I'm afraid, but thank you for your submission. And you're welcome to stay online if you want to hear the rest of the submissions.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. So our next submission is from General Distributors Limited, it's page 80, and we've got Paul Radich to speak. Welcome, Paul. So you may have seen the traffic light system. You'll have 10 minutes for your submission, 7 minutes on green, 2 on orange and 1 on red. You don't have to speak for the whole time, and if there is time left, councillors may wish to ask questions. And just make sure your microphone's turned on there. Should have the green light illuminated.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you. When you're ready.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to come and talk to you today. I'm going to spend less time talking about court battles and various other things and talk more about what we do as a business. First of all, the initial draft LAP was supported by General Distributors Limited. Our view is where we can support a particular community, we will. So we support the 10 p.m. closing. We're not going to suggest for a moment that the default trading hours should apply. Our issue is primarily the further shift to 9 p.m. closing, and that's a position we don't support. And we don't support it for a number of reasons. Mr. Thane touched on the issue with some of the reasoning behind it. I'm going to talk more about what we do. My role has been with Countdown for 4 years. I am previously a licensing inspector for both Manukau and Auckland City Councils, so I have seen it. If it's to be seen, I have seen it. I started with Countdown 4 years ago and we had some issues. We've worked incredibly hard to turn that around for ourselves and be the best liquor retailer in the country. We have over 2,500 managers. We have 5,500 what we call age-restricted goods sellers in our stores. They're the ones who walk around with the lanyards on their chests and come over and have a nice chat when you're trying to buy alcohol and scan the barcode. They are required to train and retrain every year, which is a standard that is much more stringent than anything the Act imposes. If they don't manage to requalify every 12 months, then they lose that privilege of approving alcohol and that position. We are very tough on it, and we are very tough for very good reasons. With four stores that we operate down here haven't fallen afoul of any of the provisions of the Act. They are, without question, what we like to call clean skin. So the shift to 9 o'clock, we're struggling to understand. We're struggling to comprehend, and that seems to be based on the paper, because people front load, or people buy alcohol to front load prior to 9 o'clock. So the shift 2 hours to 9 o'clock has somehow been drawn as a natural conclusion. We understand that logic. We're struggling to understand that decision-making process, and that's why we don't support it. There are other tools in the mechanism. In the short time that I've been sitting here, you've heard of a number of suggestions as a way to address antisocial behaviour. I would ask the council to look at those in a more in-depth way than, as much as I don't like agreeing with anything Foodstuffs has to say, to be honest, this is a very blunt tool to try and address a problem. There are significant other measures both in the Act and through both police, council, licensing inspectors and the medical officers of health to deal with problem premises. I would encourage the council to deal with problem premises rather than applying a blanket rule. I'm happy to answer any questions. My submission you all have. This is more for me to come down here, talk to you face to face, and obviously answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Paul. We appreciate that. Elected members, are there any questions? Councillor Butt.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for your submission. I was just wondering, your submission shows that the Countdown Broadway has a off license from 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. while the store closes at 10 p.m. Is there a reason that there is 1 hour after even the close of the store?
So depending on the time of the year, the store hours fluctuate. So if it's a particularly busy time of year, for example, leading up to Christmas, leading up to Easter, public holidays, the store hours can move. So we need that flexibility in the licence to allow that to occur. What we said in our original submission on the original hours that were proposed by the council was, we'll address that, we'll fix that, and that's why we supported the 10 o'clock closing. We knew that would make life a little bit more problematic for us, but we understood what the council was trying to do.
All right, thank you. I was thinking you're trying to sell alcohol after the close of the store.
No.
Thank you. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks, Paul, for coming in and being willing to have a conversation about sort of how things work on the ground and practically. Really appreciate that. I guess, there's a possibility in terms of how I would read the regulations, at least, that somebody could sort of rock up to one of your supermarkets 5 minutes before closing, fill a whole shopping cart with as much alcohol as they wanted to, and proceed to purchase. So what sort of, I guess, staff response and staff training is there in place to sort of recognize potential incidents of harm that may be coming from those sort of activities?
I'm actually glad you asked that, because that's part of the internal training that we go through. So talking very briefly about the ARG, so we do have, as Hospitality New Zealand mentioned, we do have our licensed controllers qualifications, we have our general managers up and down the country. Like I said, we have 2,800 of those. The internal training, though, is supermarket specific. So the first year the team go through that. It's a 4-hour course, and it talks about assessing people at the checkout, assessing whether there are what we call group buying procedures going on. So if a bunch of teenagers rock up and are pooling money to try and get the one legal person to buy alcohol for them, but also assessing whether what they're buying in their trolley is actually appropriate. So the team are trained to have qualifications around how they're going to consume it, to be honest, people rocking up and buying a trolley full of alcohol from our stores is very, very rare. But they are trained to have those conversations, then make a decision whether they're going to sell it, because they still have to approve it. Just because somebody walks up to the checkout with that product doesn't mean that we're going to sell it. And we've got a very strict policy that regardless of what the decision the checkout operator makes, we will support it. So our checkout team can never get it wrong. If they have a hunch that somebody's necessarily going to buy a whole lot of alcohol and then head home and drink it all that evening and they refuse to sell it, absolutely we support that decision. There's no questioning of that. I have to say though, the one thing I do agree with Mr. Thane is we are a supermarket, we're not a liquor retailer. So what you're describing is extraordinarily rare, and I actually haven't heard it occurring in one of our stores. But the team have every right to say no. And we're in a fortunate position because while we're a sales-driven business, we can assess each sale as something, do we need it, or is it going to damage our brand?
Thank you. So can I just then understand, I guess just in maybe general numbers, sort of how often that call is made not to sell? Is that sort of 1% of potential sales or 0.1%, or how? Because I've not, I guess, I shop quite a bit too, and I've never actually observed sort of supermarkets making that sort of call. So I'm just trying to understand how frequently that's actually exercised.
Usually people who are refused service complain to me. So alcohol is roughly 1 in every 10 customers purchases some form of alcohol from us. It's 10% of our sales. So this year there have been 740 complaints, bearing in mind the COVID period as well, where people have been refused service for whatever reason.
And is that a typical year? I mean, you mentioned COVID, and I know there's changes in alcohol purchasing patterns during that time. So in a typical year?
No, usually it's much higher. But what we saw with COVID is people shifted to an online purchasing behaviour rather than going into the store. So our online activity increased significantly. So the interactions between team were much less.
Thank you. That gives me some sense of scale. Madam Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. We've run out of time, but thank you for your submission and for being available to answer questions.
Thank you for your time.
So, Councillor, our next submission is from Alcohol Health Watch. It's on page 109. I'd like to invite Nathan Cowie, the Health Promotion Advisor, to speak. Nathan, just check that your microphone is on. The green light should be illuminated.
Yes, it is.
Yeah,
Thank you, Madam Chair.
When you're ready.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Nathan Cowie toko ingoa. He kaimahi ahau, e mahi ana ahau ki whakatupato waipiro. My name is Nathan Cowie, and as Madam Chair has said, I'm a Health Promotion Advisor at Alcohol Health Watch. So I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to speak again here today. I'm sure I'm not the only one here with a sense of deja vu. I do want to acknowledge Palmerston North's commitment to developing this local alcohol policy and the persistence and patience, especially of staff through the development of this policy. We recognise that the extra hour of trading, that last hour of trading, whether in a supermarket or a bottle store, whether in a bar or a nightclub, it may bring private profit, but it does come with costs that are borne by the community. Now, the purpose of a LAP in the Act is to minimise alcohol-related harm, prevent alcohol-related harm where able, and to reflect community views. That was the priority objective of the new Act. It is not a policy tool for economic development, though reductions in alcohol harms will have economic benefits through less cancers, less injuries, less emergency department presentations, less violence, less sexual assaults, less lost productivity, and less burden on our police and emergency services. We can uncap our potential with less drinking and less alcohol harm, and to do this we need to put community health before industry profits. Councils have an obligation to actively protect Māori health and well-being. Māori are significantly more likely to drink hazardously than non-Māori and experience high levels of acute and chronic harms. Alcohol-related mortality in Māori was double that of non-Māori in 2007. We know that young Māori males have a higher risk of hazardous drinking from living close to licensed premises. Tamariki Māori have at least 5 times the exposure to alcohol advertising compared with European and other children, and a good part of this comes from advertising and signage at licensed premises. Now, I note that Palmerston North does have a higher proportion of Māori than New Zealand as a whole, and that the Māori population in Palmerston North is expected to grow strongly. The Crown has obligations under Te Tiriti o Waitangi to actively protect Māori, and we believe this obligation also extends to local government. Alcohol Health Watch does support councils developing wider alcohol harm reduction strategies beyond local alcohol policies. We invite councils to look beyond licensing issues, to think about what can be done about advertising, marketing and sponsorship, and to contribute to national discussions around the price of alcohol. So trading hours are essentially your number one best buy for a local alcohol policy, and we do acknowledge that Council has proposed closing hours that are earlier than the default maximum hours. We support controls on the number and location of outlets, and we do recommend that councils give strong consideration to controls so as to prevent future proliferation. And we also recommend that council offers protection to sensitive sites from new licences, as we have listed in the written submission, and we recommend that this protection be given within 100 metres of sensitive sites. On to on-licences. The later on-licence premises trade into the night, the higher levels of alcohol harm are felt. It does get worse after midnight, and each additional hour of trading tends to see more alcohol-related harm. We do not support 3 a.m. closing for on-licences. We do recommend a maximum closing hour of 2 a.m. for on-licences. And we have recommended a number of discretionary conditions, including a one-way door to cover the last hour of trading. And regarding the one-way door, our preference would be to have an earlier closing hour of 2 a.m. And also, in the absence of an earlier closing hour for on-licences, we strongly recommend that Palmerston North City Council, together with police, health and other stakeholders, investigate establishing a multi-agency violence prevention group along the lines of the Cardiff model of violence prevention. Key to such a partnership is the sharing of anonymised data from emergency departments on violence location, time, weapons and number of assailants. Crime analysts combine and summarise police and emergency department data to identify areas and times of violence concentrations. Combined information then informs strategies designed to address specific risks and patterns observed in the data. Evaluation of the Cardiff model has found that the information sharing partnerships between health services, police and local government has altered policing and other strategies to prevent violence. And this has led to a significant reduction in violent injuries. The Cardiff model has been adopted in many British cities and also in other cities such as Amsterdam, Atlanta, Philadelphia, in the state of Wisconsin, and it's also being evaluated in a multi-site trial in Australia. However, I must reiterate, our preference would be for that earlier closing hours. Implementation of the Cardiff model will provide strain on resources for police and for emergency departments. On to off-licences, we do acknowledge that the proposed off-licence trading hours are more restrictive than the default national maximum, and we do support the maximum closing hour of 9 p.m. We do not support the early opening hour of 7 a.m. We recommend hours of 10 a.m. to 9 p.m. for off-licences, and we make this recommendation to all territorial authorities around New Zealand. New Zealand research has shown that alcohol purchased after 10 p.m. was twice as likely to be made by heavier drinkers. And these are sometimes the ones going in for their second purchase of the evening, having already consumed their earlier purchases. and we believe that a closing hour of 9 p.m. should, in all likelihood, offer further protection. In regards to the opening hour of 7 a.m, this is early for anyone to be buying alcohol. We believe it is not unreasonable for off-licences to wait until after 10 a.m. To start selling alcohol. And we believe this will also provide community some extra protection for heavily dependent drinkers and for children and young people who are travelling to school. We do recommend that Council consider further controls on the number and location of new outlets, particularly in areas of high socioeconomic deprivation. And it's not uncommon around the country for LAPs to impose caps on new off-licences, for example in Horowhenua, Wanganui and Wairoa. In Calgary and Edmonton in Canada, new outlets are not permitted within 300 metres and 500 metres of existing licences retrospectively. So there's proximity controls to avoid clustering. Now, we support the intent of Palmerston North Council to review the LAP after 2 years. We do recommend that Council develop a monitoring and evaluation plan and take a cautious approach to interpreting the resulting data. So, in summary, reduced trading hours for all licences are strongly encouraged. We also encourage Council to consider additional controls on the location of licensed premises, particularly off licences. And we encourage you to put health before profits and to put community interests ahead of commercial interests. Alcohol is our most harmful drug in society, and like tobacco and gambling, it must be regulated very carefully. Thank you very much for listening. I'm happy to take some questions now, but also extend the invitation to get in contact with either myself or our Director, Dr. Nikki Jackson, on any alcohol-related issues in the future.
Thank you, Nathan. We've got a question from Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Nathan. I was particularly interested in the Cardiff model that you referenced, and I'm interested to hear in the submission from the licensee that they seem to be suggesting a similar process. So that is something I'm interested to explore further. I just wondered, in your international referencing, was there any evidence of connection with Indigenous peoples in those international pieces of work?
Not that I'm aware in the international literature that we've cited in here. There is reference to other ethnic minorities and disadvantaged groups, but I can't tell you specifically about international Indigenous groups and their exposure to alcohol-related harm in the international evidence that pertains to trading hours and location availability.
So, can you confirm for me, there's nowhere else in New Zealand that's adopted a similar model that we could look to that's just...
The Cardiff model? Not that I'm aware of. It seems to be a more kind of anecdotal approach. For example, Waimakariri District Council, they moved their on-licence hours to 1 a.m, and in the report for their review of the LAP, they had comments from two local police officers who described the difference that it had been made in the town centre and the reduction of violence.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nathan. The time's up. Thank you for your submission. So our next submission is from Hospitality New Zealand, Palmerston North, and I believe we've got Adam Parker on the Teams app. Adam, are you hearing us?
Yep, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, thank you. And have we got Colleen Maxwell present?
Yes.
Yes. Welcome, Colleen. So I understand that, Adam, you're going to do the speaking of the presentation, and then Colleen will be available to answer questions. Is that how you're going to?
Certainly will.
Yeah.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Yeah, that is correct.
Okay, well, when you're ready, thank you.
Okay. I understand that you have a copy of the presentation in front of you, because I'm not able to share it on the screen, unfortunately. If you don't, not a problem. I'm just going to talk to that. So you all have a copy of the submission, but in summary, to start with, we do support the status quo, so the continuation to allow on licenses to hold a 3 a.m. license, should they be granted one. and we do not support the implementation of a one-way door policy. So first, I just want to point out that the initial draft policy was quite respectable in terms of an evidence-based approach in comparison to some other councils that I've seen around the country. But the most recent proposal, and rationale, it just appears to be the opposite somewhat, and it seems to be based on the feedback from submitters in the last draft proposal, which there's nothing particularly wrong with that. It just seems like if we're going to implement something like a one-way door policy, there should be some sort of, we should be looking at some models and studies from the past to ensure that this does actually work, as opposed to just assuming that it's going to work to fix a preloading issue. So the reality of the one-way doors, and admittedly, you know, there's not an absolute ton of research done in New Zealand. So a lot of the studies that I cited in my submission, as you'll have seen, are from overseas cases and from overseas models. But regardless, I still think that many of them stand up. But one-way doors have been trialled in both overseas and in New Zealand over the past 15 years. The majority of them have been rejected as they've brought about the increase of behavioural problems. So a respected Australian criminologist, Professor Ross Hommel of Griffith University in Aussie, has extensively researched one-way door policies, to my knowledge. And after one of his most recent studies, he empathetically told the Legislative Assembly of Queensland Law, Justice and Safety Committee that, and I quote, "The 3 a.m. lockout is a complete, absolute, 100% failure from all of the data that we've been able to observe. It is what I regard as a politically attractive but completely ineffective strategy." Fongaray in 2015 concluded a statistically significant increase in antisocial behaviour upon the introduction of a one-way door policy. However, I'm not going to go with my assumed confirmation bias on this. There were city safe patrols also introduced at the same time, and therefore the stats that were gathered may simply just be based on more observations of this type of behaviour. But I still think, regardless, it may show some evidence that one-way doors do not decrease this kind of antisocial behaviour. So, as you're probably aware, Hospitality New Zealand have been around for 100 odd years now, and we've obviously seen a lot of these types of policies being implemented around the country and trialled. And we personally, you know, we're a big advocate of reducing alcohol-related harm. We are obviously we're trained sufficiently to be able to support our members in this way. But we've witnessed incidents where one-way door policies have separated groups of friends on a night out. And that's anecdotal feedback from our members when they call us with issues that they've encountered and how to resolve them. And the one-way doors have quite a lot of implication for vulnerable individuals. And not only that, the implementation of the policy is likely to create more disorder in the streets at 2 a.m. And I think, as Gary mentioned before, I did hop on this call a little bit late, but as Gary mentioned before, if we chuck everyone out on the streets at 2 a.m., you know, and there's not enough police support, then we could be in for a bit of a diabolical situation, especially when people are intoxicated and turned away from bars at 2 a.m. after queuing. I can only imagine the unintended consequences. So look, I'm going to keep it short and sweet because I understand that you've probably got some questions for both me and Colleen, but we do recommend that Council consider some of the following initiatives to enhance the vibrancy and safety of Palmerston North at night and support a robust, sustainable nighttime economy. So again, as previously mentioned, a better and more extensive public transport option at nighttime, considering that, yes, things are working at the moment, but the amount of people that are going to be thrown out of the venues at that time of night, we're going to need to look at that. If we do implement this policy, which, yes, we're against, but I understand it might go ahead, we want to make sure that we implement it with the safety precautions around it. So a greater enforcement of liquor bans and a greater police presence, in our opinion, would hopefully mitigate some of those problems that we're likely to see. And that's pretty much it. So over to questions.
Thank you, Adam. Councillors, we're open for questions, if there are any. Councillor Finlay.
It's interesting to listen to what you're saying you expected would happen with the 2 o'clock closing. With the experiment we had a couple of years ago, or a year or so ago, did you find those problems existing?
I can't speak to that, Councillor Finlay, because I wasn't part of Hospitality New Zealand when that took place. I came on board shortly, maybe a month or two after that had concluded, so Colleen might be able to speak to that.
Yes, I can definitely speak to that. I have a hotel here in town, which I've been running for 20 years. Because of the functions, my guests tend to come in earlier, and I like to call it at 2 a.m. So they filter out, go home. I have no problems getting taxis. But we did find when we trialled the 2 a.m, I couldn't get taxis for my guests because we were struggling to get anything with town. People stayed on right till 2 a.m. So, as Adam said, everybody dispersed all at once. So there was major problems, more so for in town than I had on the outskirts. So it definitely didn't work. And I can see with having a one-door policy, although in my submission I said I'd support it if it's a compromise, but I can see for the bars, which are all pretty close in town, it's going to be carnage.
Well, just on that, at the moment, do all the bars, are they all close at the same time now?
Yes.
So they don't have trouble?
The 3 a.m. they close, but
Yeah.
people start filtering out of their own accord. So they start to filter out from about 1:30 through till 3. And you'll find at 3 a.m. there's not a huge amount that are still there, but taxis can keep because it's stagnated.
Thank you.
One of the biggest problems we find down Main Street are the party cars, the kids loitering around the party cars, and that needs to be nipped in the bud.
Thank you. Are there any further questions? No.
Sorry, Madam Chair. Just quickly, just to add to what Colleen was just saying there. I think, you know, if I'm correct in remembering what the initial policy was written for, it was the intention behind it was to try and mitigate some sort of issue with the preloading. And I'm still yet to understand how we think a one-way door is going to tackle that. I understand the logic behind earlier closing, yet we still disagreed with it. But obviously, I'm just not yet understanding how the one-way door might actually improve that at all. But maybe I've just not read it correctly. But who knows?
Thank you. There are no further questions, so thank you for your time, both you, Adam, and you, Colleen, for coming in. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So that, councillors, that brings us to the end of submissions for this morning. We are running into the 2-hour deadline. Can I have an indication? Would people like to adjourn for a morning tea break, or would you like to press on? Press on, right. Okay, so we'll go to item 6, which is confirmation of the minutes. So I'm happy to move that we accept the minutes. Seconded Councillor Barrett. Is there any comment? No, then we'll go to vote. Thank you. Can you just check your voting devices? That's carried, 13 votes for and none against. So we'll move on to item 7, which is on page 145. I presume, Peter Ridge, you're presenting this? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. There's nothing really to add to this. It's relatively pro forma. We've heard the submissions from submitters today. Together with the written submissions, we'll be presenting a report to the next committee meeting, which I believe is in March next year, with advice on the submissions and a recommendation on the way forward.
Thank you. Councillors, are there any questions? No. Thank you very much. Oh, I spoke too soon. Councillor Dennison.
Thank you. There was a point raised around the trial back in 2017 that there was no data provided. Have we got any data from the trial from 2017?
Yes, it's been an ongoing question. The police were the initiators of that trial. We've spoken with them many times about what data they may have available. As Inspector Grantham mentioned, they didn't have an evaluation process set up, and there were a number of internal issues at the time. The short answer is no, there is no data available that we can rely on.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks, Peter. So with this being sort of the third iteration of this, are we seeing a decline in the number of submitters? Is there evidence of submitter fatigue at this point?
I hesitate to speculate on the reason why there's been a reduction in submissions this time around. One thing that has been unclear, and I've been able to get a clear sense, is how ALA, if this was eventually to be adopted and go to appeal, would treat submitters who submitted on an earlier version of the policy. I think, consistent with decision-making principles under the Local Government Act, our approach would be to take account of all information we've received to date. So we'll look at not only the submissions we've received on this draft, but also the submissions we've received on earlier drafts.
Thanks. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. That does seem to be it for questions. Thank you, Peter. So I'm happy to move that we receive the report for information. Seconded, Councillor Barrett. Is there any comment? No, then we'll vote. Thank you. That's carried 11 votes for, none against and 1 abstention. So that brings us to the end of Community Development meeting for today. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.